Okay, so in today's video, we're gonna dig into Filmist for Capture One. If you're using Lightroom, check out the other video. This one's gonna kind of be dedicated to Capture One, but I know we have a lot of Capture One users that have come over from Lightroom, and sometimes Capture One feels a little intimidating, a little complicated, but there's a lot of nuances and beauty in Capture One that help make our film looks come alive. And there's a lot of control. So what we're gonna look at is not only how to use Filmist, which really is easy. It's like as easy as the 80s. I'm not even sure if that means anything, but whatever era, whatever look, whatever film you're trying to get, whatever vibe you're trying to create in your images, Filmist helps make that easy. But we're also gonna look today at some of the nuances of editing tone and color in Capture One so that you can jump in, and if you have a look you like, but you wanna tweak it a little bit, you can just go right to it. Capture One isn't hard once you get your head around it. So let's dig in.
You know what I want to do first? I know we have a lot of Lightroom users that come over and want to move to Capture One. And Capture One has a lot of really powerful tools. A lot of people really like it. And there's some people that prefer it over that subscription model of Lightroom. So I want to give a really quick overview of the interface. Now, what I'm going to do, if you're already familiar with Capture One, I'm just going to put a skip point in the comment so you can just skip this part. But I'm just going to be real brief and kind of show you the basic layout. Of course, if you're brand new to Capture One, you'll probably want to watch some more in-depth training videos. But just to get you acquainted with the interface, this is kind of what you see when you come in to Capture One. I got some raw files loaded. Over here, I have the folder icon selected. And so I have my library, I have collections and folders and things like that I can select, similar to the way that I would do in Lightroom. Now, if you go to Window, you'll see that we have the workspaces. This is the default, and you can see that it feels a little different than Lightroom. One of the things that's different is you don't really switch between this develop mode, library mode. You have a film strip, and then you have the viewer, okay? So if you go here, you can actually see, here's the viewer, and here is the browser, or the film strip in this case, which can be expanded and dragged so that it's more than just one image. So you could split the screen here. You could make it a larger viewer, a smaller viewer. You can, of course, change the thumbnail sizes, all that kind of thing. But if you're familiar with Lightroom and you kind of like that thumb strip on the bottom, you can actually move it there. And that's one of the things about Capture One is a lot of the panels you can move about pretty freely. I have a dual display mode that I use a lot of times where I'll put some of these things on a secondary display. And so there's some versatility there. So if we go to the view menu, you can actually see I can go to browser and I can put it below, which for me is a little more comfortable, but use whatever works for you. And then I can adjust it accordingly, change the size of the thumbnails, etc. Now, what I've actually done, because in Lightroom, we're used to switching from D to develop mode and G back to kind of the grid view, I've actually gone into the preferences and edited the keyboard shortcuts here under the edit menu. And you can do that. And what I've done is I've actually put D for the viewer to kind of remind me of develop module, like when I'm using Lightroom, because the viewer is that main larger view, and G for the browser. So even though we're not actually switching operating modes like in Lightroom, I can show or hide. So I can just hit D to show or hide the viewer, and if I'm in viewer mode, I can just hit G to show or hide the grid view. And so that gives me a lot of control, and I've actually saved some custom workspaces. So I'm going to switch to a dual screen workspace here, and you can't see the second screen right now, but it just kind of rearranges my other panels in a way that is useful for me. Okay, so fundamentally speaking then, I switch back and forth between grid and viewer mode, just like this. And I just assign that to a shortcut. You can also just do that from right up here in the view menu. But let's talk about using presets. So if you come in here, you see that instead of kind of the modules up at the top, we just have this panel over on the left. These panels can actually be broken out and set in different ways. You can take the kind of tone panel, the color panel, but you can customize them. So you can add a tool down here. You could drag these tools out into a second screen, expand, collapse. But the fundamentals of what we're looking at, we're not going to get into everything because it would take too long. The fundamentals of what we're looking at, though, is we have our files that we're importing in, all right? And you can import images just like you would, fundamentally speaking, in Lightroom. We have our styles and presets, this little check mark up here. And this is where we'll see Filmist. You can see I have Filmist installed right here, and I can just mouse over and it shows me a preview of it. And you can actually you can import styles from right here. But if you want some better management and things like that, you can actually go to the styles folder. And if you need some more help installing and you want to see the paths for folders and things like that, just go to seimeffects.com/help, and we give you all the details on installing. So I'm going to assume you have them installed. And basically what we have here is we're going to use this styles and presets. And then you have your tone panel, which I've customized a little bit to my preferences by adding the panels I want. And you have your color panel. Okay, so now that you got it installed and everything's ready to go, you'll see we have Filmist right here. Let's jump right in to putting Filmist to work on your images. Now, one of the things you'll see is just a very simple design. We go through and you have everything in alphabetical order from the films that you know and love to the various concept films. And then down at the bottom, we have the Z mods, which allow you to quickly modify a preset that you've applied without fundamentally changing the look. So you can see that I can mouse over and see previews for the images similarly to the way it's an option in Lightroom. And there's going to be a lot of different looks here. Now, some of these are going to be better for portraits. Some of them are going to be better for landscapes, but they all cross over pretty well. And we're continuing to refine those and make them as versatile as possible to try and stay true to the looks that they represent, but also be really versatile and be able to handle a lot of different raw files and different situations, because every processor, every raw interpreter is going to do this differently. So even if I use something like Lightroom versus Capture One, it's a completely different look sometimes depending on the file. For example, if I take this file here of this young lady and I look at the Lightroom version, this is the raw untouched file and how Capture One interprets the color. Let's actually go over to Lightroom real quick for point of comparison. And so you can see that these images are completely different in the way the color's rendered between Photoshop. Lightroom is darker than Capture One in this particular case. It tends to lean a little more towards the reds on how it interprets. This one is a Canon raw file. Now this is going to vary. Like every raw file is different. The way we process is different. So when we design Filmist and as we continue refining Filmist, we're trying to find ways to enhance that as much as possible and find versatile ways so that no matter what file type you're working on, you can just go through. But the bottom line is when you're using Filmist, you really can just browse through until you find a look that fits the visualization you're going for at that time. And just like the Lightroom variant, the Filmist in Capture One is going to apply your color looks, it's going to apply your grain. Rather than trying to describe every preset, it really is as simple as go with a film that you are familiar with to start with, right? So I could say, well, let's do a Fuji Pro 400H. It has a lovely way that it interprets greens. It's good for flesh tones. And so films in Filmist that have the name of a film that exists in the film world, those are going to the best of our ability be trying to emulate that film. Yes, film will always be film and digital will always be digital. And as someone who loves shooting film, I respect that. But at the same time, we've gone to a lot of effort to try and get those looks to be as true to film as possible while at the same time being really versatile. Portra 160V works really good on this. Don't be afraid to mix and match. If you apply a look and maybe it's too much saturation, maybe it's just a little over the top and you want it a little softer, maybe I apply Provia right here. You can mix it up and you can go down and you can add something like a contrast pull or push to adjust your contrast. If it's a mobile image, you can use the mobile compensation because mobile images tend to be really punchy and contrasty, and sometimes a preset's going to be too much, so you can quickly dial it back. Okay, so if you go through here, you can apply any look you want. You can apply a mod to it. Now, the default in Capture One is that Stack Styles is turned on. And even though most of the presets in Filmist are global styles, meaning if I apply Portra, and then I go and apply Kodachrome 64, you can see that Kodachrome is on top and it's overriding Portra because Kodachrome affected all the settings that were in Portra. You'll notice here it's not overriding Simple Vignette because that Z mod is separate. There's no vignette built in to Portra or Kodachrome. And so Simple Vignette is still working. Okay, now one other thing we should mention is the use of layers, and it's pretty cool, and there are some things we can do with our styles. Let's take this image and just Control R or Command R to reset it. And you can see that if I choose a style, it's going to apply that to the base layer. By default, from styles and presets, it's going to go to the base layer. But we can actually work with layers. So if I go to one of my panels that has the layers palette in it, I can actually add, and if I right click, I'm going to add a new filled layer because I don't want a masked layer for this. I want one that's filled. So I've now added a layer which does nothing. Now you'll see here, if I go back to styles and presets, and I change these, it's not actually going to add it to that layer I just made. It's just going to change the base layer. But I can actually stack different looks this way, or just put them on an individual layer with some limitations that Capture One puts on us. But to do it is a little bit clunky. I wish they would improve this a little. But all you have to do is right click on the layer and then apply adjustments, user styles, and here you see Filmist. So for example, I can now go through and I can browse some different things. And let's say I pick out one that I like Color Pro P400. I can click Apply. Okay, and what's going to happen is you'll see this pop up, and you can actually make it so it won't show this. Layers won't take everything. So the layer won't take the film grain, it won't take certain settings, and it's going to show you what cannot be applied from a given style, and we can apply partially and also click Don't Show This Again. But the cool thing about this is, while in general you should apply your styles to the base layer, you can actually modify by adding it to a layer, which also allows you to control the opacity and the intensity of a style. So you can apply a style to a layer, even though it's a little bit more limited, and have more control over the opacity, and you can also mix and match that way, and it's a pretty cool tool. And of course you can use lots of other settings and masking and stuff like that. If you're not familiar with layers in Capture One, that's worth digging into as well. Of course, and something I always encourage is just to manually change things. In fact, manually changing exposure can be really powerful. Well-designed presets are generally going to assume that your exposure and your white balance are correct because it's too big of a variable and a preset can't guess at whether those are correct. So when I import, I'll do kind of a grid edit and make sure my exposure is good and my white balance is probably going to be fine, but you can always tweak the white balance. So for example, and this is very applicable to Filmist, the white balance is in your control. So when you apply a film look, it's going to change a lot of color settings. And the color settings in Capture One are really powerful. And so you can see, if we look down here, there's a lot of advanced color things going on in the preset that I've applied. However, it hasn't touched the white balance because white balance varies depending on the lighting conditions you shot at, and it's not a consistent variable. So while your white balance probably for most people is on auto white balance, that usually works really well, raw files, if you're shooting raw, are lossless. We can change the white balance to whatever we want. So let's say you apply a preset and you're like, well, that doesn't feel quite like that film should feel. It very possibly could be how your white balance is being interpreted. And for example, if I say this should be a little warmer, I can just turn my warmth up a little. Maybe it's got a little too much red. I can just adjust that. Remember, I showed even between Lightroom and Capture One, the fundamental way it interprets the raw file is different. And so sometimes if you say, well, my hue is a little bit off, I will often use white balance to adjust that, because white balance isn't really about a gray card. It's about getting the balance that you intended. Here's an example here. Here's an image that's really overexposed, but let's go over to our adjustments and let's apply kind of a cinematic look. And you can see here, these aren't doing a lot. They're kind of looking weird because it's so overexposed. I'm going to apply Cineflex Azul to this. Now, I could then say, okay, let's pull this. And the push and the pull not only adjust exposure, they compensate for contrast a bit with the intent of mimicking the push and pull concept of when we use chemicals. But actually, push and pull isn't enough here. This is so overexposed. I'm actually just going to go to exposure. And this is something you'll find a lot. Now we're getting this really cool look coming out of this image, bringing out those blues. And I could go in and let's crop this a little more uniquely here. I think more of a square crop is going to work really good here. So look at what we started with and what we ended with. And this is something that I think is important. It's important in portraits and in a lot of other situations too. Sometimes if you apply a preset to an image, or a style in this case in Capture One. So if I go and I'm like, okay, let's use the Color Pro and go with that because that looks good. I might say the exposure is a little bit too little or too much, especially with flesh tones and portraits. So like we talked about white balance, if you find that you apply a look and something's just not quite right, go into that exposure. And sometimes just adjusting your exposure on an image a quarter of a stop or less will actually bring the balance you were looking. It'll actually make the color process, the filmic look that you're applying, feel more appropriate. Because one thing to remember is that different looks apply differently. And it was this way in the film days too. Not all films had the same brightness value. We think of exposure on our cameras and it's like, well, it's correctly exposed. That's not how you think with film. And it's really not how we should think with digital. The right exposure is the one that fits the visualization that we're going for. But you'll see as we go through that different looks and different filmics here are providing lighter or darker in a sense. Even though they're not adjusting the exposure, Velvia might be darker, Velvia 100, than Natura 1600, which is a pretty bright look. And so if you apply a look and you think, well, now it's feeling a little dark, don't assume that the look is not what you want. Go play with that exposure a little bit. All of these come in groups of 3, so we could have some variables. But the 3 different looks might be a lot different from each other. They're built on the same theme, but they're not always going to be the same. It's not just low contrast, mid contrast, high contrast kind of cop out where we were trying to stuff more presets. We actually had to work really hard to not make Filmist too big so that it's easy to navigate and you can get to the looks that you want. So if you look over here in Portra, we have 3 variants of Portra, and you can see that it's based on Portra 160, 160V, and 400. And we did a lot of studying and testing and analyzing film scans and all this other stuff to get to that stage. But if you go to another look, say like Fuji Pro 400H, now this is modeled after 400H, which by the way tends to be a really good portrait stock, but it's versatile for a lot of things. I love the greens in 400H. You'll notice on the Fuji though, the other 2 have an E on them. And what this means is while the Fuji 400H is meant as close as possible to mimic that film, the E are basically electronic variants. They're like concept films. What if? What if there was a variant that was like this? What if Ektar didn't only have Ektar, but what if there was an 800 ISO variant, which doesn't look very good on this image? I prefer the standard. So while you may go as your default to the ones that are familiar with you, don't hesitate to play with those E variants too to get different looks. So here's my Ektar 100A and B. Both of these are based on Ektar, but we did a lot of study and determined to do 2 variants because the Ektar scans that we were looking at did not always have the same characteristics. And that was one of the things about film too. And it's what makes it difficult to make great Filmist type presets and styles, is that film wasn't always the same. You can't say this one look is always exactly what that film would have been, because digital is different. Each camera is different. The way our software interprets is different. And so for certain films where we found these nuances, even between different scans of the same film, we would make some variants. And then you have the 800E, which is an electronic variant. 800E was not a film that we actually had, but it gives you more control. It gives you more options built right into the set. Now there's some other ones like Cineflex, for example, and these are completely concept films in their own right. And so if I go to here and I take the Cineflex, there's no E on these, but they don't need it. The bottom line is I'm just kind of getting you acquainted with the different notations. You can look on certain ones, and if you see P, like the Color Pros, Color Pro works great for this image, honestly, but the Color Pros are kind of geared to be able to work good as with portraits as well. And so if you see a P in the name, P800, P600, it's going to be geared toward portraits. The same if you see an S, it's geared a little bit more towards the soft side, not soft as blurry, but a little bit softer color, softer contrast. So you can look for those notations. The same if you see a D, it's leaning towards more dynamic range. If you see a V, it's leaning more towards vivid, okay? An X is a little bit more extreme, maybe a color mix that's kind of unique. So those are kind of some of the notations you can look for. If it's just A and B, it usually is just an A and B variant of a film or a style that we're going for. So these are things that you can glance at as you're going through. And I don't want to dwell on them too much because it's not necessary that you remember all these things. But the bottom line is that Filmist is designed to be able to get you that film look quickly and efficiently and without a hassle. So you're probably going to develop favorites in Filmist, and they may be different from mine. And as you go along, you'll figure out which ones you like the best, but you may have an image that you go to one you like the best and it doesn't work. And then just pop over to one of the other ones, because there's always going to be something in Filmist that's going to give you a look you want. So I might go for a Provia look and think, well, this is a little bit red. It's cool, but let's do an electronic kind of concept variant of Provia that leans a little more towards the orange. We'll use Provia E100 here. And now let's go to exposure though, because it's a little bit dark. Remember what I said about exposure? We can bring this to life a little bit. That's only 0.18 on the exposure, but it really brings out the pop. And if you look at our before and after, we've got that lovely Provia Filmic kind of inspired look. Very quickly and easy. You, of course, have some black and whites down here that are also mimicking some of those classic black and white films like Delta, Delta 3200, Acros, T-Max, and more. And you can go to town on those as well. I might say RSX is really good on this one, and Agfaflex, RSX, and Ektar 100A looks really good. Ektar 100B, a little more red. I'm liking the warmer tone. Maybe I want to use a Kodachrome look. This image is accepting a lot of different filmic looks in a really versatile way. Now I might say, well, I like the Portra 160, but I like that 160V feels a little punchier and brighter. Well, in that case, let's just use the 160 and go over and pump our exposure up just a little bit. And look at how it changes. Look at how the characteristics of the flesh tones are changing just by that very subtle shift in exposure. Filmist is designed for versatility, and that's not easy. It's not easy in particular with styles in Capture One. Capture One styles are notorious for struggling with looking good on one image and not good on another image. So we spend a ton of time, and we're continuing to refine that to break that mold, to break that struggle that people have sometimes with styles. And in Filmist, you'll find that certainly there's going to be, like always, one look that may not work on the given image, but there's always going to be something that brings out that visualization. Some of them were simpler. Some of them were very complex color studies. And the beauty of using styles is not that your look takes on my look. It's that we can get the visualization, the look of color, the look of film, whatever it is we're going for, without endless tweaking, because there is a ton of subtle tweaking in the colors and in the nuances of Capture One, and it is very powerful, and it's helped us to get some really cool looks. Most importantly, just have fun. Try the looks, scan through them, get the one that works for you. Add some of the Z mods if you need to change the characteristics a little bit, or go in and manually tweak it if you want to do that. There's certainly nothing wrong with that either. The goal is to get you rich Filmist looks that we simply wouldn't get if we were doing everything manually, because it would take too long to get there on every image, because every image has different characteristics. Filmist takes care of that for us, and it makes that beautiful, rich Filmist look.
Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope that helped you, especially if you're new to Capture One, if you're a veteran Capture One user. Some of these things may have been basics, but maybe just bringing them all together in the context of using Filmist will make your workflow a little bit better. Using the film looks, the different types, where they fit, using the mods, and then customizing them to your needs. So hope you guys enjoyed. Make sure you let us know if you have any questions. Head over to the website, seimfx.com/help if you need to get a hold of us, and we're here to help. That's what we do, and this is Filmist.